Salve discipuli. Today we're going to discuss the last two verb tenses for the active mood, the pluperfect and the future perfect tenses. And before we talk about how to conjugate and translate these two last verb tenses, let's do a quick review of the tenses that we already know. For present tense, our endings are ost, mustus, nd for the I, you, he, she, it, we, ya, all, and they forms. And we translate them in the present tense with verbs is verbing or do or does verb. The imperfect tense, on the other hand, has a BA signal marker, or if it's the irregular verb sum esse, it has an IRA signal marker for the endings bam, bas, bat, bamus, batis, and bant. And if it's the irregular verb sum esse, it will use that ERA marker and add the MST, mustis, NT for eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratis, erant. And as a past tense of repeated past action, we most frequently translate the imperfect as was or were verbing, but there are other possible translation options such as used to verb, began to verb, kept on verbing. In the future tense, we have two separate ways of conjugating our verbs depending on whether or not they belong to first or second conjugation. First and second conjugation verbs being those verbs that end in ARE or an ERE with a macron in the infinitive, and third conjugation verbs being those verbs that end in ERE no macron or an IRE. First and second conjugation verbs are formed with a bo, bis, bit, bimus, bitis, or bunt ending. And if the verb is third or fourth conjugation, your future tense endings will be ace, et, amus, atis, or ent. Now, our irregular verb base for our irregular verb sum esse is ero or erre or eru to have the forms ero, eris, erit, eremus, eritis, erunt, and the future tense gets translated with the helping verb will verb. Our last tense that we've reviewed is the perfect tense, our other past tense, and this is a past tense that happens only once, which means that we need to use our third principal part for the perfect tense, and to that third principal part we will add the endings isti, it, imus, istis, and erunt. Now discipuli, if you didn't need to take notes on anything that we've said so far in the video, you already know just about everything that you will need in order to conjugate the pluperfect and the future perfect tenses. So let's just do a quick little check to see how much you do know. Discipuli, here we have the three principal parts of the verb amo, amare, amavi, to love on the video. Which one of those principal parts do you need for the perfect tense? The first, second, or third? Agapai discipuli, it is the third principal part that we use. We'll take the third principal part, take off the I, and then add the rest of the endings to that base. Two last questions. We have the three principal parts of our primary irregular verb to be, sum esse fui. Do you remember how to conjugate this verb in all of its people and numbers, first, second, third, singular and plural, in the imperfect tense? Remember, this is an irregular verb, so it's not going to use that signal marker BA. Instead, it's going to use a different signal marker. Go ahead, pause the video while you try to conjugate this verb sum esse in the imperfect tense. Agapai, if you are left with the forms eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratis, erant, these are the imperfect tense forms of sum esse. One final question for you. Can you also conjugate sum esse in all of its people and numbers, first, second, third, singular, and plural, but this time in the future tense? And remember, we're not going to be using our bo or our bit endings, and we're not going to be using our or our ace endings, because those are for regular verbs, not the irregular verb sum esse. Go ahead and pause the video while you try to conjugate sum esse in the future tense. Agapai, if you have this conjugation on your paper, ero, eris, erit, eremus, eritis, erunt is the forms and conjugation of sum esse in the future tense. Discipuli, if you got all three of those questions correct, All you need to do is focus on how to translate your pluperfect and your future perfect verb tenses as we encounter them. You already know everything else that you're going to need to know to conjugate them. So to begin with, let's start with the pluperfect tense, and in Latin that is the plus perfectus, or the more than perfect tense. And since the perfectus tense is a past tense action that is completed, this really is the more than completed tense. And hopefully any questions that are bubbling in your brain right now will be answered with this video. How can a verb be more than perfect, more than completed? Disciply, the pluperfect tense is in part used for a past action that happened a long time ago, and we'll use our translation had verbed or had been verbing. Now notice this helping verb had as opposed to the helping verb has or have verbed. Had is the past tense of has or had, so really we're using the past tense of our helping verb has, have, plus the past tense of our actual action to make it a super past, a double past, which will indicate that it happened a long time ago. For example, Hannibal had sworn an oath. Now, Hannibal had sworn this oath sometime in the mid-Republic, so that's approximately 2,500 years ago, quite a long time ago from our perspective. So we would use the pluperfect tense, the super past tense, to indicate that that action happened a long time ago. Now the pluperfect tense can also happen in the past before another past action. And let's write a timeline up on the board so you can get a better idea of what I'm talking about. Here we have the present tense plus the future tense. Now, when we're talking about our sentence, our exemplum here, because Hannibal had sworn an oath, he crossed the Alps to fight the Romans. What we really have are two past tense actions, had sworn and crossed. Both of these are in the past, but one of them has to happen before the other. And in this example, Hannibal had to swear the oath before he could cross the Alps. Now, both of these verbs are in the past, but swearing the oath has to happen before the second verb, which is why had sworn is in our pluperfect tense in English. We can recognize the pluperfect tense because it will once again use the third principal part, just like any verbs that are in the perfect system. And we want to look for those stem markers or those spelling changes, the V's, the S's, the X's, the U's, the reduplications, or the macrons. And then we're going to add to that base, the third principal part, the forms of sum esse that look like the imperfect tense. So what we're talking about is your eram, eras, erat that I had you conjugate and practice earlier. So once again, when you conjugate a pluperfect tense verb, you're going to find the third principal part, take off the I, and then add eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratis, and erant as endings. Let's take a look with our verb amo, amare, amavi, to love. First, we're going to find that third principal part, which is amavi. We're going to take off that I to form our base amav. And then to that, we're going to add our endings of sum esse in the imperfect tense. Eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratis, erant. I had loved, you had loved, he, she, it had loved, we had loved, y'all had loved, they had loved. Another example that we have of a sentence that has two past tense actions, one in the pluperfect tense, stupit Marcus, quamquam circum maximum antea viderat. Marcus was amazed, although he had seen the Circus Maximus before. Now, once again, we have our timeline with the present and the future already written in. And in this sentence, we have two actions, Marcus being amazed in the past and Marcus having seen the Circus Maximus before in the past. And with this, we have an action and a second action that has to happen before the other action. So Marcus has to see the Circus Maximus before he can be amazed. Good news when we're talking about the irregular verbs, it doesn't matter what conjugation your verb belongs to, first, second, third, or fourth, and it doesn't matter if your verb is regular or irregular. Your pluperfect tense will always be formed the exact same way. Find the third principal part, take off the I, and add your imperfect tense endings for sum esse. As an example, here is sum esse fui. And as you can see, all we did was take the base from the third principal part and add our imperfect tense forms of sum esse to it. So fueram, fueras, fuerat, I had been, you had been, he, she, it had been. And as you can see, looking at the rest of our irregular verbs, they're formed exactly the same way using the third principal part and then the correct form of sum esse in the imperfect tense, the eram, eras, erat forms. I had been able, potueram. I had wanted, volueram. I had not wanted, nolueram. I had gone, ieram or iweram. I had carried, tuleram. Now, when we're talking about our last tense to learn in the active mood, the future perfect tense, here once again, the perfect tense is one of those past tenses, and then we're adding the idea of the future to it. So really, the future perfect tense is a past action that happens in the future. I can positively feel your questions, Disciply. Let's take a closer look at the future perfect tense. Now, the future perfect, like the pluperfect, is one of those verbs that's usually going to be in a complex sentence with at least two clauses. And that's because it describes an action in the future, hence future perfect name. But this is an action in the future that is completed, that will have been completed before some other action in the future. So let's get our timeline up on the board. And so what we're talking about when we talk about the present happens now versus the future it will happen in the future is the future perfect is at this in-between stage when it is still in the future time, but it happens before another future tense verb. So for example, the Romans will win the war if they will have developed new naval technology. Now, our future tense action is that the Romans will win the war, but before they can win the war, first they have to develop new technology. If they don't develop this new technology first, the future tense of will winning the war can never happen. So the future perfect is a verb tense in future time. It just is going to happen before some other verb in the future tense in that same sentence. It's conjugated in almost exactly the same way as the pluperfect tense, where you find the third principal part and take off the I, but instead of adding the imperfect tense forms of sum esse, you're going to add the future tense forms, or almost exactly the future tense forms of sum esse. And so our future perfect endings are ero, eris, erit, eremus, eritis, erint. And the future tense form of sum esse, as we practiced before, is erunt. You'll notice that there is a little bit of a change when we conjugate in the future perfect. The U instead becomes an I, or rather the I is kept as opposed to being changed. Our example, amo, amare, amawi, to love, we're going to find that third principal part and take off the I. To that, we're going to add the endings of sum esse in the future tense, and we're left with amawero, amaweris, amawerit, amaweremus, amaweritis, and amawerint, where once again, we want to make sure to keep that I instead of changing it to a U like we normally do for sum esse. When we translate the future perfect, we literally translate this verb with will have verbed. So all of those forms of amo in the future perfect would be translated as will have verbed. Amawero, I will have loved. Amaweris, you will have loved, etc. In English, however, we don't very frequently use this entire translation to get across the same idea, that of a future action happening before another future action. And instead, we'll typically just shorten it and use the present tense verbs. Here's an example of what I'm talking about, discipuli. Cum ad forum cras rediveritis, Euclides omnia vobis explicabit. When you will have returned to the forum tomorrow, Euclides will explain everything to you. Using our timeline for the past, present, and future, our future tense is that Euclides will explain everything to you. Before he can do that, you need to have returned. So here, our future perfect tense that happens before the other verb is you will have returned, rediveritis, and then our regular future tense action, which will happen if the other happens first, is Euclides will explain. Now in English, we're not going to use this clunky translation all the time, and instead we'll say, when you return to the forum tomorrow, Euclides will explain everything to you. Even though we're not using this translation of you will have returned, it's still clear in the English that you return has to happen before Euclides can explain anything. I highly recommend that you keep to the traditional and literal translation of the future perfect until you get more used to identifying which action needs to happen first in a complex sentence that has two main ideas. Good news yet again, all of the verbs, regular or irregular, will be formed in exactly the same way in the future perfect, and just finding that third principal part and adding those almost identical forms of sum esse in the future tense, third principal part plus ero, eres, eret, eremus, eretis, and erint. And as you can see, possum, volo, nolo, eo, and fero are formed exactly the same way, third principal part plus ero, eris, erit, etc. Discipuli, that's all for our discussion about our last two verb tenses in the active mood, the pluperfect and the future perfect. Think back to that quiz that you took. Did you already know everything that you needed, or do you know it now that we've reviewed it? And can you just concentrate on figuring out which action happens first? If it's a past tense sentence, that pluperfect verb will happen first. And if it's a future tense sentence, that future perfect verb will happen first. Valete discipuli.